Formal written English generally does not allow for many abbreviations. But that being said, the types of abbreviations that are allowed will depend on the type of document. If you're writing an essay or an article for a magazine or journal, your editor is most likely only going to allow the standard abbreviations that we're going to discuss in this lecture. If, however, you are writing a technical document or some type of business communication, the type and an amount of abbreviations that you use will be determined by the standards that your audience expects. High-tech companies, for example, have their own level of jargon and will tolerate far many more abbreviations than, say, the New York Times. For example, some of you know that I used to work part-time as a consultant for a company I used to work for full-time in New Jersey. I received the following email at one point. Tom, FYI, we've got enough to GA on Monday, but continue Xing add TCs until EOD Mon. There's another MR being planned, but not authed yet. Check with Mike on Mon. Thanks, Nancy. Now, this email uses quite a few abbreviations. First, FYI, for your information. Then we see the abbreviation GA. GA is a jargon used in the software industry. Means generally available, but what it means is that the release of software has been fully tested and is ready to be put into production or at least sent to customers for them to decide when to put it into production. So that's what GA means. So obviously with that lengthy explanation, GA obviously is a short form for all that. Mon, of course, is Monday. CONT is continue, Xing is executing, add is additional, and TCs is short for test cases until EOD, some of you probably know EOD, end of day Monday. There's another MR, and MR is also a common term in software, the software industry. It means maintenance release or maintenance request. And it is usually a fix to a bug found in software. So that's called an MR. So another MR is being planned, but not authorized yet. Check with Mike on Monday, and then thanks, Nancy. So as you can see, most of that language would not be acceptable in formal writing. But since both the sender and receiver understand the abbreviations and it's accepted practice within the company, these shorthands are permitted. With a general audience, though, it's best to avoid them. So what are the rules for abbreviations? One of the first rules is use abbreviations for titles when the title precedes a person's name. For example, Miss, Mrs., Ms., Mr., Doctor. Note that the abbreviations of single words usually are followed by periods. And also note that these titles may be used with only the last name or with both the first and last name. But nowadays it's usually not serious when you use these titles with only a first name. For example, several of my friends refer to me as Dr. Tom. That's not being serious. But what is being serious are examples Dr. Kitty, Mrs. Pamela Harding, Miss A. Stone. One exception to the rule of using abbreviations for titles with just the first name is the abbreviation ST, which is the abbreviation for saint. Saint is generally only used with the first name. If, however, there are multiple saints with the same first name, then the last name may be qualified. Then the name may be qualified by a last name or some other qualifier. For example, two famous St. Francis. We have St. Francis of Assisi. Assisi is not his last name, but that was the name that's where he was from. So we always say St. Francis of Assisi to identify which St. Francis we're talking about. Or another example, St. Francis Xavier. St. Francis Xavier was born in the ancient kingdom of Navarre, and in Spanish, Xavier is pronounced Javier, but we've changed that into English, at least, as Xavier. So there are qualifiers to distinguish between the different saints. Here we have a list of titles that may only be used when both the first name and the last name, or the first name initial and the last name are present. If only the last name is present, or if the word is used alone in a sentence, then the abbreviation should not be used. Instead, the whole word should be written out. So, for example, Gen for general, Prof for professor, Rev for reverend, SGT for sergeant, Gov for governor, On for honorable, Sen for senator, Rep for representative, Capt for captain. So, for example, Prof. B. Henry. But if I were to not have that first name initial, then it would be Professor Henry. Or Gov. Jim Justice. But it's Senator Manchin. Sen. Joe Manchin would be acceptable, but Senator Manchin is what needs to be done if only the last name is present. And then, for example, if I'm using one of these words in a sentence as a common noun, I have to also write it out. I met the governor at dinner last night. A second rule for using abbreviations for titles is when the titles follow a proper name. For example, we have the titles junior and senior. These may only be used when following a proper name, such as, for example, Thomas J. Kitty Sr. or Martin Luther King Jr. Then we have other titles such as DD, DDS, MD, DO, PhD, MA, BA, CPA, and so on. These are also may be used when following a proper noun or alone in a sentence if the meaning is clear. So, for example, Thomas Dunn, DDS. Thomas Dunn is a dentist. Thomas Kitty, PhD. Thomas Kitty has a doctorate in philosophy. Or Ralph Ellis, CPA. Ralph Ellis is a certified public accountant. So when you're using these things in a sentence, for example, I earned my MA in 1983 and my PhD in 1987. Note that when a title is used following a proper noun in a sentence, you should treat the title like an interruption by preceding and following the title with commas. Thomas J. Kitty, comma, Senior, comma, is my father. Abbreviations in the middle of the sentences retain their periods even when followed by other punctuation marks. So, for example, shortly after I earned my PhD, PH period D period comma, I moved to Italy. Note that it's improper to combine titles both preceding and following a proper name. For example, it would be wrong to write Dr. Thomas Kitty, PhD. What would be correct would be either Dr. Thomas Kitty or Thomas Kitty, comma, PH period D period. A third rule regarding the use of abbreviations is when we use the abbreviations such as Co, Corp, Inc., Bros, Limited, and symbols such as the ampersand sign, in describing business firms, we should only use the abbreviations that are part of the company's legal name. So, for example, Citigroup Inc., the Kroger Co., RMA Limited. A fourth rule is to use abbreviations for common terms that are derived from Latin. For example, IE, which stands for id s, means that is, or e.g., exempli gratia, it means for example. CF, confer, equals or means compare. Et al comes from, it's an abbreviation of et ali and means and others. Etc. is an abbreviation that means and so on. And VS or V, which is the Latin abbreviation for the Latin word versus, means in contrast with. These abbreviations from Latin are accepted in English as valid abbreviations. One interesting area for discussion in the use of abbreviations regards state names or abbreviations for states. The U.S. Postal Service created official two-letter abbreviations for every state when the state name follows a capitalized geographic term. But the Associated Press uses a different system. So you'll often see a conflict here. For example, you'll often see two-letter abbreviations from the postal system written without periods, but then you'll see two-letter ones written other places with periods. For example, N.Y. or N.J. for New York and New Jersey, or PA with a lowercase p, lowercase a to indicate Pennsylvania, or VT, uppercase V, lowercase t to indicate Vermont. And often in the Associated Press system, you'll see longer abbreviations such as CONN for Connecticut, or MASS for Mass, or Calif for California, or probably what a lot of you are familiar with, W period V small a period for West Virginia. These are generally from the Associated Press, but they are becoming less and less used in formal writing as they are being replaced by the official two-letter postal codes. Also note that for the District of Columbia, the official use there is with periods, D period, C period. Another thing to point out is that only the names of states are abbreviated. Do not abbreviate the names of countries. The exception is with the United States. In the United States, if we use the abbreviation, we want to use it only as an adjective, U.S. as an adjective. For example, the U.S. Navy, the U.S. Postal Service. And in those cases, we have the capital U period, S period, to indicate the official abbreviation of the United States, again, when it's used as an adjective. Another rule of abbreviations concerns more Latin abbreviations, or mostly Latin abbreviations, that have to do with numbers. We use some abbreviations only together with numbers. For example, BC, before Christ, BCE, before current era, AD, Anno Domini, which comes from Latin meaning after Christ or after the Lord. AM means the antemeridium, before noon. AM lowercase, PM postmeridian, afternoon, PM lowercase, and then no meaning number, both uppercase and lowercase. Then we have C for centigrade, F for Fahrenheit, a percentage sign, and the dollar sign. Now all of these are all only used with numbers. I also addressed in my lecture on capitalization that the lowercase AM, PM, and also we could add number are generally not preferred when they're used as a abbreviation. So for now, let's just prefer all of the upper cases. There are exceptions in certain style guides, which I went into on my capitalization lecture. But here, generally, you'll notice almost everything is capitalized. So 43 BCE, before current era, is another way of saying before Christ. 1066 AD is, our current era, or AD, after Christ. 4:30 p.m., number 3, 13 degrees Celsius, 44 degrees Fahrenheit, 55%, or $150. These symbols or abbreviations are only used with numbers. Another rule for abbreviations is a list that we have here that is by far incomplete, but some of the more common things you'll see here. Using abbreviations for things normally referred to by their capitalized initials and that are spoken letter by letter. And these things we generally do not use periods. They become acronyms. A lot of them are acronyms, but they're used in common English so that we know what they are, and we can use these abbreviations freely. For example, DVD, TV, CD, HBO, IRS, CIA, CNN, MIA, PX, FBI, WSAZ. These are things that most of which are acronyms, but they've come over into the language as acceptable words, or they're abbreviations for organizations that are well known, or as, for example, WSAZ or HBO. They're broadcasting entities that we generally identify with by their abbreviations rather than by their full call letters. One final point to make about the use of abbreviations is with regard to commonly accepted acronyms. When we have well-known acronyms, we do not use periods. So, for example, Sunoco is an acronym for the Sun Oil Company, but we commonly just use Sunoco as a word. NATO is another example. It is an acronym, but we use it as a word. Now we use it as a word. The National Organization for Women, we use it as a word. Or UNICEF, we use it also as a word. No, there are no periods. The other thing is, when we have acronyms that are not well known or are ambiguous, then we want to write out the full form in parentheses immediately following the first use of the acronym. Or if we're writing a technical document, we may do the reverse. We use the full form, and then in parentheses we use the acronym, and then from there on we can use the acronym in the document. So for example, here I have I have an example here of ambiguity. We have the SLA. The SLA could mean a service level agreement, typical in a contract. It could be SLA, meaning a software license agreement, commonly used in the computer industry. Or the SLA could be a abbreviation for the old Symbionese Liberation Army from the late 60s. So when we use an acronym that's ambiguous, we should identify what it means the first time in the document before we continue using it.